Good afternoon, good morning to everyone attending the webinar today. And thank you very much for registering and being here today. My name is Lalini Virasamy, and I'm the Chief of Mission of IOM in Ireland. You have joined us at a very critical time for information and data, I must say, and the onset of COVID has been particularly eye-opening, not only from the health perspective, but also at the levels of information that people relied and still rely upon daily and how it impacts directly on our lives. However, it was also hijacked by fear of the unknown, which morphed in many instances into fear of the other. I actually recently released a brief on countering xenophobia and stigma that covered so well the issues migrants were facing throughout the crisis and continue to face. Misinformation and disinformation undoubtedly play a central role in implying an already complex and polarized context over the last number of years, particularly. We're today privileged to have an exceptional panel of distinguished international experts who have unique insights on the challenge that misinformation and disinformation poses today. The United Nations particularly have implemented a call of action to addressing misinformation, and IOM has been very active. I must say, particularly our Director General. We here in IOM Ireland have had the opportunity of linking with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Irish Aid and seeing firsthand the ambition of their strategies in developing the development of education and particularly around messaging and combating misinformation. IOM in Ireland is currently working on an interesting proposal to set up a global migration and media academy, and we look forward to sharing more with you very shortly. A very warm welcome to the Irish Aid team listening today as well. I also have the immense pleasure of introducing the facilitator today, who is Leonard Doyle. Leonard, who is the Director of the Media and Communication Unit of the entire International Organization for Migration based in Geneva. Leonard has previously worked with IOM in different settings, Haiti, Philippines, but also as an editor in different international press, and including The Observer and The Guardian. So I won't be fair enough, Leonard, for his wide and extensive experience with IOM, but also in the media field. So I would pass the floor to you, Leonard, as facilitator, and thank you again to all of you and the panelists and the attendees today for joining us on this important webinar. Over to you, Leonard.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's such a pleasure to be here, especially, as you can tell from my accent, being a native son of the country where you're now the Chief of Mission. So I'm really absolutely delighted to be here to try to facilitate. And it's a terrific moment. It's a great moment for this extraordinary panel to be gathered. And I know some of you have got up frightfully early in the United States, and I tip my hat, if I had one, to all of you. But let me just get straight to the meat of the matter, which is that, you know, we all know, because those of us who listen to the news, we can bear to listen to the news, we know that migration is still very much at the heart of the public narrative worldwide. You know, huge impact on people's lives. And, you know, as somebody in IOM said not so long ago to me, when he first started the job as Director General, you know, a conversation about migration down in the bar would be short-lived. Nowadays, you can't get out of the bar. Everybody wants to talk about it. So that kind of just tells you that the conversation has changed around this topic and people are super engaged in it. And of course, it's confusing because it's highly emotional, deeply emotional. And I would say that, you know, you have a combination of top billing spot in the media of something that's highly emotional. So it makes it kind of difficult. And to the best of our knowledge, there's no rigorous or critical, accessible, expert-driven kind of piece on how do you report on migration, which, just referring back to what you mentioned, that our plans to set up a media academy on this topic. I mean, we're hugely concerned of the great mismatch also between public perceptions on migration and the reality. And even the finest reporters, even the most experienced and laurel reporters, get it horribly wrong. You know, a piece I heard recently about Libya confused refugees, migrants, trafficking, smugglers. They had it all wrong. And this was from, you know, a prominent news outlet. I'm not going to embarrass them by saying who it was. are professional journalists. So what hope do young journalists have coming out of college or in college or trying to get into the profession? It's really difficult. So that's what I think would be interesting. And also the issue of data, because the game has changed radically now, because of course, so much of the conversation is on social media. And then by the time it reaches the regular news, it's kind of old hat and the game is over and maybe you've lost the game or we've lost the game. So to that end, I'm really interested to hear some of the experts who are on today's event, who looked at this point of data and how to counter misinformation. We're trying in our own way, but we're very much in the early stages and we're really, really interested to know about that. So without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker of the day. It's delighted to introduce Professor Maria Gregiu, of the Department of Media and Communications in the London School of Economics. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, I'm sure I have. But we'd be delighted to hear your take on this issue, this issue that we're speaking about today. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Leonard. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this important conversation, as you said. A big responsibility to start this conversation, but I'll just throw in some ideas from an academic perspective, and I know that other people will come in with their wise perspectives from their different places of expertise. So I will share my slides now, which I will use as a reference while brief presentation. So we're talking today about data power and misinformation. And I would like to talk a bit about something that Leonard also touched upon very briefly, how we might be talking sometimes about information that turns into misinformation even without the intention to do so. So I think it's important to not start by talking about information that media provides a good thing and bad media providing misinformation, but actually to see how in the case of migration, the two might merge, especially unintentionally. So I think a reason that we're talking about misinformation, and perhaps the main reason that we talk about misinformation, it's because of the consequences it has on public opinion. So this is where I want to start from before I go to the media. Every time I read surveys about public perceptions on migration, I get puzzled and I also become very disheartened often when I see how little information the public has on migration. So the very typical case is the inflation of numbers of migrants, also the inflation of numbers of Muslim migrants in particular that people think that they have in their countries. So in surveys like that, the most well-known, I think it's the Perils of Perception by Ipsos Mori, shows that very often the public around Europe thinks that the numbers of migrants in their country are 10% more or even 20% more than they actually are. Such as, for example, in the case of Spain, where we have 21% more people thinking that the numbers of migrants are 21% more than they actually are. Or in the case of Germany and France, where people think that the numbers of migrants in their country are 15% more than they are. So where do these misconceptions come from? If we actually have accurate data that shows what the numbers of actual migrants are, if we have information about migration more widely available in the public space, why do people get migration so wrong? And this, of course, brings us to the field of the media, which is on the focus of today's conversation. So we're all very familiar, of course, with debates on media headlines, especially media headlines that project emotional and polarized responses to migration. We could then give a swift response to the question, where do misconceptions come from, by turning to hostile media headlines that could explain why the public can be suspicious and hostile against migrants. However, I want to draw on some of the research that we have been doing at the Department of Media and Communications to very briefly make a point that actually the problem with information that turns into misinformation is not always the fact that media become hostile or suspicious towards migrants. But actually, sometimes media being sympathetic towards migrants can be as harmful or as misleading as when media are fully hostile and negative towards migration. So I'm not going to give much detail on going from, and people might want to come back and I will provide that later on. But I want to mention three points that we found out in this research that we conducted across 8 European countries to show how media representations of migration can indirectly lead to misinformation in 3 ways. So the first thing that we found out is, as a rule, migration tends to be represented within the binary of humanitarianism and securitization. What does that mean? That migrants are either presented as victims, as vulnerable people that need care, or as threats, as people who are either terrorists, potential terrorists, or who threaten national communities by taking their jobs. The second point that we found out is that migrants, as a rule, tend to be voiceless in mainstream media. So actually, among the 1,200 that we analyzed, we found out that only in 15% of them, migrants actually speak. So the lack of voice makes migrants seem like speechless outsiders that are not humans, like the audiences, that makes it very difficult for the audiences to see them as equals and as agents who can take part in debates about migration, in debates about their own fate. Thirdly, media only rarely speak of positive consequences of migration. And in our case, 60% of the 1,200 stories we analyzed mentioned any positive contribution of migration. Thus, if we take these findings into account, it comes as no surprise that audiences can become vulnerable to misinformation. Often, even if they follow the news, many members of the audiences might have very little, or at least very little accurate understanding about migration. Very quickly, what is going on here, and the few takeaways I would like to offer for this debate, is that misinformation is not always deliberate, and it's very much and increasingly attached to the fast and furious economy of the digital media environment, where media compete against each other, of which media will become faster in delivering rather than delivering accurate reporting. The second point is that misinformation on migration is very often the result of little understanding on behalf of media institutions of the importance of migration as a topic that, as Leonard discussed, is now concerning most citizens. So there is little investment in migration journalism, little expertise. So one point that I would like to make in conclusion is that good reporting on migration, a way to tackle misinformation as diffused within the wide media environment, is to invest on good journalism. And this means that, one, the media recognize the need for migration journalistic expertise, perhaps in migration desk, something that is very rare in the mainstream media. And the second is that journalism training should have migration awareness as an integrated element, which is something that, of course, journalist organizations, the civil society that's in the field of migration very often requires. Only then the public will recognize that migration is a constitutive and important element of European cultures and politics, rather than a threat or something to be suspicious of. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really inspiring and interesting presentation. I particularly like your line that not all misinformation is deliberate. And indeed, we often, in our world, we talk about the photograph of a rescue in the Mediterranean. Looks great from the humanitarian perspective. We're so proud of it. But as seen in some, maybe particularly hostile community, can have exactly the opposite reaction. So it's all about the context. I guess the medium is still the message, to put it, to coin a phrase. So let's move to Amina. Amina Yaguda, broadcast journalist and BBC World News award winner. You're particularly interested in storytelling, and I guess that's the point of various remarks is that we don't hear enough of the stories of the voices of the migrants. Maybe you, since you're with the great and wonderful BBC, you can tell us why it's so hard to get these voices through.
I'm particularly interested in the storytelling element of journalism. As regards migrants, migration, illegal or legal, the stigma attached to migration, I think we should go deeper above the surface into the reasons in the first place for migration. And as regards that, I'd like to use Nigeria, which is my home country, as a microcosm for the African continent. Africa is a huge continent of 54 countries, but Nigeria is its largest population country with over 200 million citizens. So using Nigeria as a microcosm doesn't apply to all of the peculiarities of Africa, but there's so many similarities that cut across many of the African countries. So I'd like to start with a picture of a story that I recently covered. And this is a community in southwest Nigeria. It's called Dustbin Village. So you might be curious to find out why a community would be called Dustbin Village. Originally, that community was named Ife-Sowapo Community. That's a traditional Yoruba language, and it translates loosely as love has brought us together. It's a slum community where there are very few houses made of blocks, and mostly houses or huts and shanties made up of iron sheet, planks of wood, and a few rusty nails put together. In this slum community, there's no access to water, no access to schools, no access to good plumbing facilities. But this community accounts for a huge amount of people living in Lagos State. And so it cut across many parts of Nigeria that people are dealing with poverty. So in an attempt to run away from poverty, poor living conditions, many of these kind of people are looking to travel out of that community in search of a better life. I'll tell you a story of a lady called Ajayi Omolola. She grew up in Nigeria, and after graduating from college, or the equivalent of college, a polytechnic, she couldn't get a good job or source of living. So she talked to people in her community. At the end of the day, she was trafficked, or she traveled to Lebanon. We only heard about her story when there was a social media uprising, so to speak, about her condition. Ajayi was treated as a slave by her employer in Lebanon. She went to Lebanon under the impression that she would be she would get a job, she would be employed gainfully, and should be able to send back money home to her family. But unfortunately, that was not the case. As soon as she got to Lebanon, her passport was seized. She didn't have access to a human condition of living. She was essentially a household domestic slave. And so she took a video of herself speaking in her local language and sent it on social media for people to come to her aid. And so on social media, the video got a lot of likes and retweets, and then traditional media picked up that story. Fortunately for her, after the story got viral on social media, Nigerian authorities were able to investigate and bring her back home. But I'd also like you to understand that it's not just people who are escaping poverty who move out of the country in search of greener pastures outside the country. Recently, just last 2 weeks, 58 Nigerian doctors were planning to travel to the United Kingdom on a private jet that was chartered for them by a UK authority. Out of the 58 doctors who were going to travel to the United Kingdom, only 2 had valid visas to travel to the United Kingdom. And so Nigerian immigration services had to turn them back. So doctors in Nigeria are earning compared to other people in the country, they earn quite a good living, but they also want to leave the country and move to United Kingdom, to Lebanon, to other countries in the world because they feel like they have a better opportunity in those countries. If we can move to the next slide, please, Owen. And so one of the issues that I've uncovered with our journalistic practices as regards migration is that our journalism tends towards promoting popular sentiments and echoing social media. This is not a proactive response to migration issues. It's a reactive response. At the root of the issues concerning migration, be it legal or illegal, there's a bit of the journalists are not going to cover the root of the matter. They're waiting until it becomes hip or it becomes a trending issue before they cover those stories. So that could be another reason why we're getting it wrong in terms of storytelling. Next slide, please. Johan, can we have the next slide? And so we've heard about, journalism practices, one of the and the reasons why people are trying to move out of Africa to Europe and the rest of the world. But what about issues to do with media literacy? How can the media help people understand, or potential migrants understand, the risks involved in such a perilous journey? How can they help people be better listeners or better consumers of media news stories? Well, the access to news and information today in Nigeria, for instance, is mostly through social media. Mobile technology is largely responsible for a huge amount of consumption of news. In Nigeria, we have the 7th largest amount of mobile phone users globally. Of that amount, 128 million people have access to internet. That's from 2019 data. But is this the key population that should be targeted with news concerning migration policies, illegal migration, and legal migration issues? Not really, because the people who have access to internet connectivity and mobile phones sometimes might not be a particular group willing to migrate out of the country in search of greener pastures. At the grassroots, people who cannot afford a good living do not have access to mobile phones or mobile phone technology or internet connectivity. So in that case, it is quite possible that we're missing a huge amount of people who should be targeted with particular news stories in terms of trends in migration. And so critical evaluation of news stories in Nigeria, we have over 250 ethnicities. We have over 500 languages. People often interpret media messages based on the colorations of their ethnicity, of their language. So the global news agenda does not adequately respond to Nigeria's ethnic colorations, or indeed Africa's. So if you're sending a news story, for instance, on the BBC or on CNN, and it's largely done in English, you're not targeting the people who need to hear these stories. And so there has to be a considered approach concerning people's ethnic loyalties and their perceptions of news stories. In the Nigerian media landscape, for instance, if a news story happens about migration, illegal migration, already Nigerian Immigration Service knows that there's certain ethnicities in the country prone to illegal migration. They also know that there's certain ethnicities in the country who are more homegrown, who are more focused on living, staying in the country and making a better life. And so all these considerations should be put in place when you're having a discussion or you're telling stories about migration? How do people perceive this news? How do they, on what cultural frame do they understand what story you're trying to tell them? So if we can move to the next slide, please. Next slide, please, Owen. And so storytelling in traditional African culture, we have an oral tradition wherein members of a community gather under a huge tree in the village center, and the village elder tells stories about the culture. And this medium is a way to transmit information, is a way to transmit new knowledge, is a way to transmit moral codes. So these kind of techniques should be incorporated by modern day journalism. You need to consider the contextuality of African culture when you're fashioning or when you're putting together a news story. More often than not, the global news agenda doesn't focus on these kind of peculiarities of Africa. So the impact of misinformation at community level in placing people in positions of vulnerability is largely due to the fact that messaging is coming from an outside source. If you want to target effective messaging in terms of migration issues, the key actors who should be incorporated in the messaging strategy should be sourced locally. Next slide, please. And so the myth of the grass being greener over there, outside the continent, outside the country, is often perpetrated by a number of factors and actors. Organized trafficking has often been overlooked. There's I don't want to call it a value chain, but there's a organized method and structure through which people are illegally transported outside of the country and into Europe. We have recruiters, we have agents, and we have madams. The recruiters are people in the local community who actively source for vulnerable groups, people that will be prone or would be biased towards traveling out of their country in search of a better opportunity or better livelihood. So the recruiters are people in the community, known by local agents, known by locals in the community. And so these recruiters go on to target vulnerable groups. And then the vulnerable person is induced to raise a certain amount of money with the aid of their family. In fact, sometimes they sell all of their valuable properties to raise the money to hand over to an agent who will facilitate or smuggle the illegal migrants out across the Sahara and into Europe, often going through Libya, through to Portugal, Ceuta, or sometimes onto Germany. So there's a chain of events that happen from the grassroots up till when the migrant arrives in the country as an illegal migrant. And sometimes before they finally make that perilous journey across the Sahara, something called a madame, a person called a madame, is often part of that process. Before they leave their villages, a madame who's oftentimes a sexual a prostitution kingpin or a pimp would go into the community, target a vulnerable person, and induce them by saying they can make sure they can help them get to Europe, but they have to swear a blood oath. In Nigeria, in local communities, so many people who believe that voodoo, black magic, and swearing blood oaths can actually be a covenant that would end in a fatality if they do not stick by the terms and conditions of that oath. So there's so many ritual practices that these people go on to have that makes it difficult for them to even report that they've been trafficked illegally eventually when they get into Europe and other foreign countries, because they believe that they've sworn a blood oath, and if they reveal the details of how they made that journey from their home country to Europe, they would either die or some terrible affliction will happen to them. So traffickers utilize lack of data literacy and access to accurate data and information to promote the idea that the grass is greener. So these vulnerable groups are usually people who have no access to data. They have no access to information on the internet or to broadcast media. These are people who are the poorest of the poor in the country. And so traffickers take advantage of their situation to make them believe that once they leave their local communities, they have a chance of a better life outside the country. Next slide, please. And so the problems include a lack of data and coordination between government, civil society, and international organizations, which leads to a reactive and not proactive approach. So we need to focus on cooperative between government agencies, civil society, interfaith groups, local community leaders, and other charitable organizations to make sure we target the root causes of illegal migration. At the end of the day, in as much as there's a lot of political will by government, there are minimal resources and supports to local communities to engage. So talking about, again, being proactive, we do not need to wait until there's a serious issue concerning migration or there's someone who has been totally violated and it comes to our knowledge through social media. We need to be focusing on the issue from the beginning, from the root cause. So community actors, local chiefs, village heads need to be properly trained and giving support to enable them make sure that once they realize that someone is vulnerable to go on a perilous journey, that person can be talked to and you have enough support or resources to make sure that person decides to make an intelligent decision by staying back home instead of going on a illegal journey outside the country. So campaigns and initiatives usually are short-lived and they're not sustained. So those campaigns, media campaigns towards stemming the tide of illegal migration usually just happen at the spur of the moment and in reaction to social media outrage. They should be targeting campaigns instead in the beginning of the process before even a vulnerable person is targeted. So campaigns should be focusing on the root causes and not become reactive to social media likes or retweets. Next slide, please. Owen, can I have the next slide? And so money is often and the solution too. And so if we want to stem the tide of illegal migration and the stigma and xenophobic traits attached to illegal migration, there needs to be more funding of efforts to stem illegal migration. There has to be a collaborative and considered approach to delivering messages, which must include cultural reinforcement to build resilience. And within the community, you must take recognitions of local actors, village heads, community leaders, youth leaders. Those kind of people need to be incorporated in a collaborative approach towards stemming the tide. And our news organizations also should use more local journalists and storytellers. Their content should be tailored to feed the specific needs of the locality. So if you're targeting information from a global news agenda, you might miss the mark because it doesn't get to the intended audience. And at the end of the day, even if it gets to them, sometimes that audience is unable to interpret the message in the way that you have sought out to propose that message, because there's so many cultural references which hamper the understanding of that news story. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, that's the final presentation. So one quick takeaway is that global news agenda is often not the local news agenda. So news agendas should be focused on the intended audience, bearing in mind the peculiarities of that local community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina. That really, really thorough and fascinating presentation. I think what we've learned in the IOM perspective is that these campaigns don't work very often. These top-down campaigns, paid for by a donor, implemented by somebody from outside the community, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. If we have, whatever credibility we have, I think we have even less in that context. So with that in mind, and having read some of the, very interesting and critical research on campaigns, we started something a couple of years ago called Migrants as Messengers. The whole idea is that the migrants being returned or voluntarily returned from Libya, where they've ended often in horrible conditions, we just figured out that those people are the most credible, and they will take it home. Many said, no, they'll be too embarrassed to talk to anybody, they won't do it. But actually, they got the bit between their teeth, and they formed their own bands of volunteers going village to village. So really interesting perspective, I think. So thank you for that. So let's move, if I may, to Antonio Battaglia, of the Director General for Neighbourhood and Engagement Negotiations at the European Commission. I know you're particularly interested in misinformation. It's the piece about migration that concerns us most, and how whatever openness there was towards migrants in Europe seems to be draining away as a result of the rather toxic media environment. But we'd be really interested in hearing your perspective, Antonia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to talk about what the European Commission is doing actually in general to tackle misinformation and disinformation. Let me start by saying that the infodemic generated by the COVID-19 pandemic has put the disinformation complexity under an additional spotlight, demanding more than ever a rapid response by the EU, the organization, and the governments around the world. We have observed that during these past months that the pandemic has in fact triggered completely a powerful reminder of the fact that disinformation complexity is more important than when we thought, and that hoaxes can put lives in danger and change profoundly our societies, building on uncertainty, mistrust, and pushing to racism. The digital environment that we have observed during the past weeks has proven an essential lifeline to millions, but also has led to a massive wave of disinformation, because we saw, as it was already mentioned before, a rise in dangerous frauds and misleading healthcare information, a flare in hate speech, blaming minorities for the outbreak of the pandemic and the consequences, and the blaze of conspiracy theories wanting to endanger human health, harm cohesion of our societies, and slow down generally almost everywhere reforms or create long-lasting social unrest. As you know better than I do, misinformation in migration can have immediate deadly consequences, putting in danger the lives of those who are exposed or forced to migration. Some actors we have also seen, and our communication of the 10th of June on tackling disinformation around COVID-19 is a clear sign in that sense. Some actors have sought to exploit the challenges that we face, trying to undermine our citizens' confidence and trust. Targeted campaigns by foreign and domestic actors have tried to undermine the democracy, as I said, and the credibility of the EU and of the global actors together with the EU. So this is more important than ever now that cooperation and a more coordinated action around misinformation, to tackle misinformation, is carried out by the EU institutions together with the United Nations system and the member states. And this is more crucial and urgent than ever. The Commission has been working, as you probably know or heard, on a very broad and comprehensive set of tools to address misinformation and its consequences, both inside the EU but also outside the EU. Before zooming into the details of the tools that we have, let me give you a general helicopter view of the principles that have been guiding our work and strands of work. What are we doing and how? There are actually 4 areas of action in which the Commission has been engaged and is still, of course, more engaged than ever. The first one is fight misinformation and disinformation with more targeted and objective, tailored strategic communication work, timely information output that reaches out at community level, both inside and outside the EU, filling the gaps and cutting directly into local debates. And I think that in respect to migration, the work that has been conducted by our delegations in Jordan, Lebanon, and across the Western Balkans goes very much into this direction. There has also been across the EU a general change in tone, in the sense that we have acknowledged fears, problems and uncertainties, and we are also more direct in asserting the EU values we stand for, what we believe in, and the factual responses that our actions carried out. The second strand of work actually concerns the work in partnership that we value more and more, the EU as a global actor together with the United Nations and together with member states, working closely with a lot of agency. IOM has been always and is more than ever a precious ally of the European Commission in the neighborhood and in the Western Balkans countries, but in tackling misinformation and in carrying out actions to inform the public, we have also worked, and we work a lot with the UNOPS, with UNICEF, and of course the great effort that the President of the Commission, the UN Secretary General and WHO are carrying out over the vaccination and the health issues is more important than ever and speaks a lot about it. We also have a very strong strand of work with media and fact-checkers. For example, I can mention the latest batch of strong support to media freedom and pluralism, which is concretized by the 7 ongoing projects for 7 million euros funded lately by the European Commission. And then the third strand of work reverts around activating communities. You may, of course, have heard that yesterday the European Commission launched an EU-wide public consultation to gather views on new actions that could be taken to promote the integration and social inclusion of migrants and people with a migrant background. And there are a lot of projects that involve Directorate General Home and that concern ways to involve migrants directly in policy-making actions that the Commission will have to take on in the next months and years. At the same time, we have also more local actions. For example, Directorate General Communication is producing toolkits for teachers in schools around the EU to help teenagers and young kids understand what disinformation and misinformation is and what are the main issues at debate, among which, of course, the migration. Directorate General Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations has also increased work with young people to address a lot of strands of issues, both in the East Partnership and the 6 East Partnership countries, but also around the Western Balkans with the network of the Young European Ambassadors. And in the Western Balkans, we also work with the European Endowment for Democracy to promote grassroots initiatives and involve civil society more and more and young people and communities, and trying to really pass the messages of what the work is and what our values stand for. Let me now run quickly, not to take too much of your time, but on our fourth strand of work, which is about inoculation and direct outreach, which is done a lot by our delegations, as I said before, on the ground, but also that will constitute the bulk of the future work of the European Commission in this respect, which will be concretized by the European Democracy Action Plan, which will be made public in the fourth part of 2020, and on which Vice President Jourova is working, and she has already spoken about it in several of her speeches and public interventions. Zooming in very quickly on the tools we have in our hands, let me start from the Code of Practice on Disinformation of 2018, which involves the platforms, as you know, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, and since June this year, also TikTok. They are accountable, they provide reports, and they work with the European Commission to tackle online disinformation, misinformation, and bots, and to avoid the spread of illegal hate speech. The second pillar of our work is the Action Plan on Disinformation, which actually was an answer to the European Council's calls for measures to promote the Union, protect the Union democratic system. Along the Action Plan for Disinformation, there is also the Rapid Alert System, which links together the EU countries together with European institutions to try to come together and give unified responses when it comes to disinformation campaigns and have coordinated reactions. The newborn baby of the European family in this respect is the European Digital Media Observatory, which was just born on the 1st of June 2020, and which is a quite ambitious project aimed at creating a European hub for fact checkers, relevant stakeholders, academia, in order to support not only general media literacy, but also policymakers and link with media organizations. Let me also quickly mention the latest communication of the Commission on tackling COVID-19 related disinformation, which is a communication together of the Commission with the High Representative Borrell, and which will feed into the European Democracy Action Plan and into the Digital Services Act, for which the Commission has just initiated a public consultation. We also have a lot of work which is realized by our colleagues from the External Action of the European Union, from the EAS, who have a dedicated website, EU versus Disinfo, where they really debunk stories. And we have a lot of strategic work which is carried out by the different Directorate General and the delegations and representations, both, as I said, outside the EU and inside the EU. Just before giving the floor to the next speaker, for the future, two main angles to look at: European Democracy Action Plan, and, as I mentioned before, the Digital Services Act, for which the Commission has already initiated a public consultation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for that very comprehensive overview of the work of the European Commission. Indeed, enormous amount of work and concern goes into this area. What I think concerns me as a former journalist, maybe with some blue ink in my veins still, is how in this day and age of social media, where somebody will spend weeks on a story and basically not get paid, how can we grow a cadre of reliable, trustworthy journalists who will stay on this story? So with that point, I'm going to switch the order of speaking ever so slightly. I'm sorry to disappoint Maher for a second, because one of our speakers has to leave very soon. So we're going to turn to Maria Teresa Ronderos, Colombian journalist, highly regarded, on the board of the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation, huge insight and knowledge of reporting. So I look forward to hearing maybe your take on how does the ordinary journalist starting out, or the student would-be journalist, get through this blizzard of misinformation and get paid at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for accommodating to give me a space a little early. What I want to share with you an experience which was really unique. We created this Center for Investigative Reporting for Latin America, which is called CLIP. And one of our biggest projects that we worked for we called it Migrants of the World. I think it has a different kind of connotation in Spanish, because when you say something is from another world, you mean it's very good. It's something that you look up to. So when you say it in Spanish, it means like del otro mundo, which means it's very good. So the Migrants from Another World was a project to actually share a light on the migrants from Asia and Africa, going in through all of Latin America, traversing the whole continent, heading north towards North America, Canada, and the United States. And in doing this project, which was a collaborative project, we ended up being 18 media outlets working together. Some of 11 or 12 of them in Latin America, 2 in Europe, and then about 3, one in Africa, in Cameroon, and 1 in India, and 1 in Nepal. Because what we did, which is something that Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say all the time, you have to tell the whole story. And we believe that the stories of the migrants were not being told completely. So what did we do? We went and not just told their story of this little part of their journey or this little part of whatever that happened to them, but we tried to tell the whole story from the very beginning, from where they went, how and why they left, So working, for example, with our Cameroonese colleague, he was able to really tell the story of why people are leaving Cameroon right now. And then we could tell the story of the journey, but we also found and interviewed with partners from the US, how was their life once they were home? I mean, in their new home in the US, and where were they disillusioned? Was the whole thing worth it? And we actually tell whole stories. And so what did we learn? And this is part of what we learned. First of all, in Latin America, and since I've been dealing with this subject for some time now, in Latin America, there is systematic misinformation that is deliberate. The little bit of investigation that we've been doing, there are lots of videos, and especially against the Venezuelans, which is the big migration explosion in Latin America. And of course, regarding the Africans and the Asians, there's also a lot of misinformation. And what we found is that the journalists don't have the tools to investigate one video where it came from. So they just simply replicate it. So media act as a huge distributor of information without even realizing it, just because they're underpaid, as you said, they're overworked, they have to produce 10 stories a day. So they just get something on Twitter or whatever, or on Facebook, and they just replicate it. So I think there is always one of our colleagues actually put his mind to understanding what were these messages behind this fake news. And there's 3 messages very clearly repeated like a mantra. One is they are coming here to invade us. 2, they are taking advantage of our generosity and our kindness. And 3, they are being benefited by governments unfairly more than locals. And this is constantly repeated in all kinds of different kinds of. So you use the same video to say they were Venezuelans, and when you go and assaulting a cafe in Peru, in Colombia, in Mexico, and when you go and look at the video, it was actually a video of people who had nothing to do with Venezuela. And my second point that I want to make, which is something of a discovery during this big project that we were talking, that I was presenting, is the false narratives. I think that those are much more dangerous than than the fake news, because fact checking is quite strong in the world. They're checking constantly. There is the network of fact checkers in the world. There is a lot of money and thinking put around fact checking. And I think eventually journalists will become literate enough, digitally literate enough to check a video or something like that. But the really worrisome part, and I think this summarizes a little bit of what all of the other colleagues have been talking, is this false narrative. The false narrative that a lot of well-meaning, nice people refer to constantly without even knowing it. How did we find it? They talk about migrants as if they're not part of a globalized world. So their money is welcomed, but they're not. They have all kinds of gadgets, communications, and communication travels all around the world, but they're not allowed to travel. Everything is pushing the migrants out of their countries. There's business interests, there's arms trafficking, there's all kinds of forces in the world that are pushing migrants out. But when it comes to seeing why did they leave, it's all their own fault or their own complete. People have been making, but they're also being pushed outside. Then there's another kind of false narrative. The flexible rules facilitate human trafficking. So when a country has flexible rules and an organized migration policy, the whole talk of media, the police is, there is human trafficking because Brazil lets the Africans in. And because they let them in, then there's the human trafficking. when it's what we found is completely the opposite. It's when there is no clear policy, when policy is changing every day, when they, you know, to the ebbs of the political situation, and when its borders are completely closed, as it is the case with the United States, which has been closing, human trafficking actually blossoms because they charge people to let them pass from one country to the other one where it is forbidden, not where it is possible. So if, for example, in Costa Rica, what we found from the migrants from Asian Africa, Costa Rica has a very organized policy. They receive the migrants on the border with Panama, take them on a bus to the border with Nicaragua, and they don't charge them, they don't persecute them, they make sure their children are okay, they give them health support. These are not massive numbers. Asians and Africans going through Latin America, according to our calculations, go between around 14,000, 15,000 every year. It's not a massive number. And they manage them very well. And there is really no trafficking, no smuggling in Costa Rica, except for people who have been caught, they're so-called Mama Africas, Mother Africas all over Latin America, and sent to, because they are trying to help people go through Nicaragua, go through the other parts which are much more either dangerous or forbidden or whatever. So some are based in Costa Rica, but because they're helping people up, but nobody is charging anybody to get into Costa Rica. So that's the second, the other kind of false narrative that we found. And the other false narrative, I think they've already mentioned, which is always associating migrants with poverty, pity, and crime. So this is always, news of migrants are always news about crime and human trafficking or news about poverty. And actually, when we talk to these migrants, and we even hired a migrant that was coming, a journalist migrant from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was in Mexico, stranded in Mexico, and he became part of our team of reporters. And what was amazing was to listen to them and hear them out. And actually, they're not poor. A lot of these people, a lot of them, were not poor. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to make this trip. And they paid traffickers. It's a very, very flawed calculation and a very generic calculation, but we more or less calculated between $200 million and $300 million is what all these 15,000 or 17,000 that passed to Latin America pay traffickers. And if that's what they pay them, what if they were able to use that money to invest in those countries or to raise a family or to start good instead of giving that to organized crime? And so a lot of them have paid 20,000, 15,000, 10,000 to get through this ordeal. And people who can pay that, they're not absolutely poor. And a lot of them were educated, were teachers, designers, engineers, journalists. We found all kinds of people. And because of xenophobia and the color of their skin, people tend to think they're poor because and there is a lot of that. So we wanted also to show that, we found that there were actually all kinds of people. Of course, some of them are very poor or they lost everything in a war, and that doesn't make any difference. But it's always like portrayed to the country like they are a burden to the country. A lot of the things that we published, and we tried to publish it, and the other one, part of the false narrative, is the way you show the pictures, the way you construct the narrative. So we made a big effort. I sent you the link in case you want to see it, but we tried to construct a narrative that was light and and it's about dreaming, and it's about nature, and it's about how do you say, birds fly and migrate, and migration is a natural part of human being, and people travel because of different situations. And of course, we told their stories, but more, they told their own stories. They talk about their dreams, and they talk about what they are and what they, other than migrants, you know, their life they're not just migrants, they're people, and they're human beings with dreams like we all have. And one of the most interesting reactions we've been having from this big project is a lot of people who said, I've never cared for migration, I don't care about this. I was fascinated by this story because it was like they got into the story because it was not the same old story about being absolutely poor and downtrodden. And of course, we do tell the horrible passage through the Darien, which a lot of people died. But for example, that could be so easily preventable. And we counted from 2016 until now, we did a big effort, investigative effort. We counted 110 people killed in that part. And yet, nobody's really caring about those. Nobody really is doing anything about it in terms of, the governments are not getting together. They could solve that problem in a moment. So, conclusions. What we need specific training and a lot of support to journalists on how to expose misinformation. I think we need to understand network analytics. We need to understand, not just expose the little fact check the fact that this video is false, but also see how it traveled and who posted it first and who is posting all the videos. Because if you are able to do network analysis, then you are able to really spot who are the distributors of this fake news and what is their political purpose. The second part, I think, I think one thing that is key is to support, if you want to support journalism, if people in countries, governments, the EU wants to support journalism, it needs to help journalists cover whole stories. So whole stories are very, very expensive because you have to be in I don't know how many countries at the same time. But if you do collaborative journalism like we did, it wasn't expensive because we were not paying a lot of people. We were all joining forces of our own media. And these stories were published in Cameroon, in Nepal, in India, in UK, in all of Latin America and in the US. And it had a huge impact, and it told the whole story. And finally, I think the last part, I think, is we need more access. Sometimes it's very difficult to get information and make your way through this maze of bureaucracy in the International Migration Office or in the Interpol or when you want to get information. It's really difficult. It's difficult to get an appointment. It's difficult to get access, even for such a large project. Some of our requests for interviews, we are still waiting for answers, and it has been 4 months and 2 months since we published. So thank you. That's what I wanted to share, and it would be lovely if you could have a look at these. Many of the stories. Some are in French because we wanted to publish them in the language of the migrants. Some are in English, and some are in Spanish, and some are in Portuguese. So you can find, we couldn't translate everything into every language because we didn't have the resources, make an effort to have them in main stories connecting to those migrants.
Thank you so much, Maria Teresa. I could listen to you all day. I know you have to run away, but it's been a really fascinating and heartwarming presentation. I think I can tell we have a lot to talk about in the future. We on the IOM side will be thrilled to publish and republish the pieces you spoke about in our what we call our news desk, which is an attempt by us not to put out the IOM propaganda, although we do a little bit of that, I have to admit. But we also try and group together the stories that are relevant to migration. But of course, we're an international organization. We've got to be careful about, all the usual things. But the real point of what we're trying to do is to grow the space and give people more information on the relevance of this topic. Before I turn to Maher, yeah, I'd be delighted to. But just before I turn to Maher, I just wanted to make a point that what you spoke, when you mentioned about analyzing the networks and the repetition of the message is particularly important. We are in the early stages, but we will share work later on that we're doing with the Sheffield Hallam University in the UK of analyzing millions of tweets to see what are the networks, which is the irrelevant one and which is the organized one, so that in a future time, not too distant, I hope, a news editor could react and say, look, this is coming from a political objective, and we can tell the story. It doesn't mean it's bad particularly, but at least you can understand what's behind it. That's the objective.
That's something we want to do too. We want to produce a big piece on this information on migrants. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I would also like to say now that we'll be looking for some questions between you at the end of this session, but now I'm going to turn to Maher Nasser, an old friend of mine, Director of Outreach at the United Nations Global Communications Unit Team Division. Sorry, I usually get that bit wrong. Maher can speak for himself, and I think he's exactly the right person to speak after you, because take it away, Maher, but it's all about misinformation.
Thank you, Leonard. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all. I'd like to start, of course, by thanking IOM Ireland, IOM Media and Communications Division for organizing this timely and important webinar. And of course, it's been a pleasure to hear all the distinguished panelists so far, and I'm looking forward to hear the remainder. Data and communications are always important to ensure that, of course, that we always make decisions based on facts and science. And somebody who studied engineering, I know about all numbers and how important they are, because without having the right numbers, buildings would collapse and bridges wouldn't carry cars and people. But when dealing with a pandemic, data and communication is not only important, it actually becomes essential. And we have seen in the time of crisis how disinformation can be used and played by political forces in 2018. And I think Leonard will, I'm sure with IOM, everybody in IOM remembers how the discussions, countries that were leading the discussions on the Global Compact on migration have walked away from it after approving the text on the Global Compact on orderly regular migration in July 2018, and they didn't even go to the conference in December, based on targeted disinformation campaigns in a number of European countries. Today, 23rd of July, actually would have been the start of the Tokyo Olympics. UNDP yesterday suggested the need for a temporary basic income for the world's poorest. These are two examples of things that would not have been possible had it not been for the impact of COVID-19 crisis. A crisis that started as a health crisis, but it's no longer just that. It's a humanitarian crisis, a social economic crisis, and a human rights crisis. Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Saturday delivered the Mandela Lecture, and he focused on the issue of inequality. And he said, COVID-19 is a human tragedy, but it has also created a generational opportunity to build a more equal and sustainable world based on two central ideas: a new social contract and a new global deal. A new global deal that is based on fair globalization, on the rights and dignity of every human being, on living in balance with nature, on taking account of the rights of future generations, and on success measured in human rather than economic terms. That, he said, is the best way for us to change this. Now, how does this relate to this webinar? Our next battle, I think, is the infodemic. We are already in the middle of the infodemic war. COVID-19 is a biological virus. There's another virus that is distorting reality, that is impacting our ability to limit the spread and destruction created by COVID-19. We have seen already voices discrediting a future vaccine. We know from WHO and from health advice that the main way for us to get out of this crisis is when we have a vaccine that can actually protect the population from further waves and infections. The some recent polls and some suggest that many people and vaccine hesitancy is growing. And partly because, of course, we know that a vaccine takes 10 years to create, 10 to 12 years to create a vaccine. But now and this is a positive side, is that we are seeing unprecedented cooperation across borders, across science field, between researchers, different universities, different companies. The EU is very involved in the vaccine acceleration initiative, supporting that we might have a vaccine as early as 2021. And if the vaccine isn't taken by everyone, or there's a high rate of rejection of the vaccine, then it doesn't really work. So there's already a big interest in terms of correcting the information about the vaccination and how vaccines works. And I know from my own growing up, I'm a Palestinian refugee. And if you go to the Middle East in the 1970s and 1980s, the infant mortality rate in a refugee camp was about 20 per 1,000 in the refugee camp, and outside of the camp in the communities in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank and Gaza was higher, was about 200, 300 in the 70s. And the reason why was vaccination, because in the small camp, there was a clinic run by UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. People had access to the vaccines, and vaccines work. We know that. Vaccines managed to get rid of smallpox, and polio is almost eradicated except to 2 countries. So science and data shows us that vaccines do work. Unfortunately, we are seeing the disinformation, and you don't necessarily see this on the front pages of newspapers or, well, actually, maybe some newspapers, but on mainstream media. And this is where we come to I think Amina mentioned that, and Maria Teresa and others, is that people are no longer just getting their information and news from media and established media organizations. Social media has become a major source of information and therefore also disinformation. So this is why in April, we launched the COVID-19 Communication Response Initiative as part of the department effort to correct the misconceptions, misperception about the COVID-19, but also that are generating obstacles and blaming migrants, blaming refugees, blaming minorities, blaming others for the virus. We have seen conspiracy theories about the relationship between 5G and the virus. We have, the vaccine will be used to plant chips in people. I mean, however crazy it is, you've heard it, I'm sure. So how do we address that? And I think part of it was, we know that the UN, we are not the best communicators. And in the old days, we used to issue a press release or a press conference or issue a report. That is no longer really enough. So we partnered with Purpose, and we launched a website called shareverified.com, where the information on it is being verified. If it's health information, is verified by WHO. If it's socioeconomic, it's verified by a relevant part of the UN. We collect that information and we package it in a way that is easily shareable, easily understandable, and in a way that is not really UN. If you go to the website, and you can see some of those examples. And the other element of it, which is also tapping into something that Amina spoke about, that people really mostly trust each other. They trust their network, they trust their friends. So we put out, if you go to the website, you're asked to volunteer, to become an information volunteer. So far we have 17,000 information volunteers who receive regular information, verified information content that they can share through their network with their friends, their family, that sort of addresses the issue of misinformation on vaccines, but also on other things, because the campaign, and as we see this, it's not just the importance of taking the vaccine, that when there is a vaccine, the vaccine has to be given and available to all. It's not that the majority of people need to make it, but we also make that it's a people's vaccine, that is a vaccine that isn't only available to those who can afford it, or to the countries, developed and rich countries. That because wherever the virus is on the planet, the pandemic is there. There is no border that can keep a virus away. We know that, we have seen it. And we have seen that the only way to deal with it is through data, through information, through collaboration. The campaign is premised on the need for data, facts, but also on solidarity. That as we create a campaign, as we look at the impact on health, we have to also be aware of the impact on social economics. So solidarity within communities, between communities across the world. And the UN has looked at the different impacts on the different parts and most vulnerable parts of the world. Policy briefs have been issued regularly to the tune of one a week, almost. Today, we issued a policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on the Arab world, and how we use this crisis to build, as I said, started with quoting the Secretary General's lecture when he spoke about the need for a new global deal. How do we inspire what we see already happening around the world, the new movement, people going out to protest against social injustice and racial injustice, and a movement that rejects inequality and division. It unites young people, civil society, private sector, cities, regions, and others behind policies for peace, for our planet, for justice and human rights. How do we tap into that? And I think by working together, not only across the UN system, not only with governments, but also with media. And I think here I want to say something about the platforms. When we talk about social media and messaging apps, they have become the main source of sharing information among people, even though you might, maybe I will see an article in a newspaper and then I will share it through my network. But social media platforms have a role to play. I think it's important that we all pay attention to what we share with each other, and we actually looked into the science behind this. And if you interrupt the urge to share something by a few seconds of suggesting to somebody the need for reflection, then they will discover, and going to the points that Maria Teresa was outlining, where is this video? Who wrote it? Who created it? How old is it? Where was it? How verified is it? Maybe then you will decide that you don't want to really share it. So on the 30th of June, we had a part of the verified campaign. We had a moment, spike moment. We called it pause. Take care before you share. That before you share something, just pay some attention to see whether that is really authentic, that you really want to associate your name with sharing this information, creating a little bit of a introduction, some critical thinking before you share something. And now with social media, with a click of a button, we share something with thousands of people. And that something could be harmful, could be hateful. And I think this is where the issue of the platforms need to go beyond the issue of individual responsibility. The platforms have a responsibility to deal and take away hateful content, misinformation and disinformation that could harm people, anti-vaxxer material, or people who are questioning the benefit of social distancing or the masks. I think these are the kinds of things that we also need to push social media platforms globally to themselves take, and we are engaging with them, and many of them are very responsive, and we're actually very heartened by the engagement we have that is ongoing, and we hope to have more of that. So these are some of the things that I wanted to touch on, and I'm looking forward to further maybe engagement with you, Leonard, and the other panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maher, for that really magisterial overview. Really terrific. And I think it's particularly interesting to see that the United Nations, given the restrictions you have, is actually taking this very adventurous approach to communications, which is essentially crowdsourcing done at a distance and enabling it. And we wish it all the success. I mean, it's the state of the art. Let's get people to communicate amongst each other, and let's get wiser voices out there rather than key messages, as we keep hearing in the UN system, which So thank you so much for that. Really terrific. And I would encourage everybody on the panel, if you are not already subscribed to the Verified campaign, do so, and you get an interesting email every other day or every day, which you can pause before you share, or you can share very quickly as you choose. But with that, let me please turn to Tom Fela, Head of Journalism and Communications at the National University of Ireland in Galway City, which I have to tell you, I have to tell those on the panel, if you've not been there, it is the best city. It is the link between, it is at the boundary between the Gaelic Ireland and the Anglo-Ireland. And it has played its own role, I think, in communication over the years, over the many centuries. Tom, please join us and give us your insights, please.
Well, Gio Cordia, the self-culture of hello, everybody, and you're all very welcome to Galway, which you'll see virtually behind me. The university created these virtual sets for us all to use. It's a bit corny, but you'll forgive me. So good afternoon, and thank you very much first to Liani and to the IOM team for inviting me. I'm delighted to have been invited to take part in this, and I wanted to talk a little bit about disinformation and fact-checking and what we can do to counter some of that. So hopefully you can see my screen. I guess I wanted to start with what some of you might consider quite a provocative image. This from Breaking Point, the campaign by the then leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, during the Brexit campaign, and Donald Trump's famous wall on the Mexican border. This is not a new issue. The misinformation and the misrepresentation and the disinformation around migration has been going on for quite some time. And I often use the phrase weaponizing of information, where information is used, bent so far out of shape to be unrecognizable, and used as a weapon in political battles. And very often it is migration that's used when it comes to these sorts of issues. I'll show you another image of some UK newspaper front pages. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of these. There's quite a few of them around that also demonstrate that migration is often used as a way by the news media to frame the agenda for political purposes, particularly in the UK, particularly around issues like Brexit, issues like the EU, and borders and so on. Interestingly, I lived in the UK for a number of years, and the perception versus reality when it came to that issue was quite extraordinary. There's quite a lot of data actually that shows that migrants are net contributors to the UK budget. Quite a lot of the NHS heroes we keep hearing about in the UK right now are migrants to the UK system. Their health service simply couldn't survive without high-skilled migrants coming to the UK. And this report from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford very much shows that a lot of the and one of the previous speakers mentioned it, a lot of the false narratives that have been created around migration are in fact completely unfounded and completely untrue, and yet we keep seeing them reported and repeated over and over again. And there's probably a good reason why we keep seeing them reported over and over again. It's quite simply because they're not verified. Nobody is fact-checking, or not enough people are fact-checking, not enough people are verifying. This is a really great slide, and it's not mine. It's from Claire Wardle at First Draft, and so a hat tip to her. She talks about the 7 different types of mis and disinformation. I won't go through all of them here, but we all know that quite a lot of content actually that we all see, I'm sure we all are members of different WhatsApp groups or different social media platforms that we subscribe to. We see quite a lot of misinformation, which is, may well be information that's misleading or information that is shared genuinely by people out of concern, but has no basis in fact. And then there's quite a lot of fabricated content, the more disinformation, information that is intended to deceive or to manipulate, or to create a false context, or to or in some way a false connection. So there's a lot of it around. It's quite sophisticated, and we do need to be very careful when we are sharing content online. And the media has a role to play here, and social media companies have a major role to play here. And I'll come to those in a couple of minutes. I want to talk a little bit about how misinformation is spread. And a couple of speakers have already spoken about doing network analysis, for example, when it comes to finding nodes of tweets or finding originals of Facebook posts and so on. It's very difficult to do, but certainly that's important. But a lot of information is spread actually by social media is a huge generator of it. The mainstream media equally is a huge generator of misinformation. And what are termed hidden networks or closed networks. So that would be things like Facebook groups, or the more sinister dark web type places. So but we don't need to go to network analysis to find misinformation. It's actually in our everyday lives. We're carrying it around in our phones almost every day. At the same time, UGC, or user-generated content, is very much front and center now of how news media, the mainstream media, tell their stories. Be it video from a monsoon in Sierra Leone, be it an atrocity in Syria, be it video from a refugee camp in Ramallah, or an incident in Latin America. A lot of material is shot by ordinary people, digital sources. It's uploaded to social media, and it makes its way into the news system. But unfortunately, social media is a wild west when it comes to this. Algorithms reward emotive content, not facts. And so the more emotive the content is, the more chance that content gets spread. The algorithms don't actually ask the question, is this true or not? And even if it is true, it may be out of context. It may have been true 2 years ago, but not now. It may be true in one country, but not in another. And it may be pertaining to be somewhere that it isn't, or so on. Going back to Claire Wardle's discussion around false context and misleading information and so on. And what other speakers have termed false narratives, particularly around issues like migrants, are in evidence in news media and particularly on social media. So misinformation is rampant, and we're not doing enough to fact check. We're not doing enough to verify. And when I say we, I mean media, and I mean social media companies in particular. Data is part of the answer. It's not the only answer, but it's part of the answer. Data has huge potential to inform debate, to make evidence-based policy decisions. There's a real need for high quality, reliable, and trustworthy data. There simply isn't enough of it around. It's not being created, it's not being recorded, it's not being shared properly. It needs to be open and accessible. The previous speaker from Latin America discussed that actually getting your hands on data is quite difficult. And the reason it needs to be open and accessible is you can record all the data in the world you like, but unless we can trust that it's true, the data itself then becomes a weapon potentially. But there's a real requirement, I think, for significant training of media and civil society groups to be able to access the data, to be supported to access that data, and to analyze it properly. Otherwise, there's a real danger of what other people have called data elites, this sort of small cabal of people who have access to data, and the rest of the country or the rest of society with little or no access to that data, creating data elites. So just a couple of conclusions that I wanted to draw from that very short discussion is that, I suppose the first point I would make is that misinformation really spreads like wildfire on social media and on closed networks, such as WhatsApp. And this really contributes significantly to framing the public view and to spreading false narratives. And in this case, we're specifically talking about migrants and migration. And we need to think about public digital literacy programs to counter that. There's a role to play there for government, there's a role to play there for civil society, for non-governmental organizations, for international organizations, and for social media companies as well. The second point I would make, and I've been involved in a number of initiatives around this one, is that journalists also need training. journalists need training, particularly around data. Data literacy among journalists is very basic. One of the things I always hear is that the reason I became a journalist is because I was no good at maths. So it's very basic. The knowledge of data, the difference between a percent and a percentage, being able to read a spreadsheet, being able to understand significance, being able to understand things like correlation versus causality. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to train journalists. And I'm not just talking about journalists in developing countries. I'm talking about journalists in Ireland, in the UK, across Europe, as well as journalists who are working in developing countries. So that's a really big one. That journalists need to be trained, and civil society groups. Not all media is created now by journalism. So we have really good work being done by international organizations and by NGOs around creating communication and creating information. They also need training to be able to use data and access data. And media and social media need to take more responsibility for the spread of information and their role in that. And they need training how to verify user-generated content. There's a lot of work has been done, but it's very much a case of a lot done more to do in that area. And the last point I would make is that international organizations also need to do more and can do more to encourage governments, to encourage state organizations to collect and to disseminate high quality, reliable data, to make sure that's made available, to support training efforts, to support organizations and initiatives like the Open Government Partnership and open data projects, because data really is probably one of the best defenses, or one of the best offenses even, against countering misinformation. I was heartened to hear the speaker from the EU and the last speaker from the UN talking about their commitment to those kinds of areas. I'll leave it there, but if anyone wants to contact me, please feel free at any stage, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really terrific to hear you, and a great overview and very thoughtful. So I very much appreciate it, and I look forward to reading your slides with more care when I get a chance to do so. Thank you very much for that. And I think just later on, I'll come back to Jane Suter just to talk a little bit about the work that's been done, in particular on analyzing data, just to see if we can come up to that point. Okay, why don't we do that? Jane, maybe you could just join us a little bit on that point and tell us a little bit more of the the work that you've been doing specifically on misinformation.
Yeah, so I've been listening. So I think we've actually been working on quite a lot of the different areas that the different speakers have spoken about. So I was quite struck first with what Tom was saying there about the journalism training. So we actually have a European Union Marie Curie project called JOURNALISTIC, which is about journalism and training with digital and with media and so on. And we're engaged with actually trying to write up a new curriculum for journalism in the digital age. And one of our PhDs, her field work, for example, is in Eritrea and in Sudan. And she's found that a lot of the material, which reflects, I think, some of the earlier speakers, that a lot of people are producing their own material on video on their own phones in countries, and it's not necessarily material then that journalists are using. Rather refugees and migrants and different people are put more into preconceived camps rather than their own voices coming through. So that's something that one of our PhDs is working on, and she's been doing some training with our MAs about that. So I thought that was quite interesting that was coming through. And then some of the other studies we've done are kind of more the big data, the sort of network analysis that Tom was talking about there. So we did one where we followed the conversations on Twitter around the refugee crises around 2015 and 2016, and looked at the different frames and the networks that were coming out of that. And again, we found it was very binary, with kind of humanitarian frames on one side, and then some kind of security ones, and then some overtly racist ones. But they revolved around they were kind of hijacked, especially some of the more problematic ones around different political personages. So, for example, some of the problematic ones revolved around Trump and so on. So we started delving there into a little about how this happens and kind of what the affordances are, particularly of the recommender algorithms on social media. So the recommender algorithms on Facebook and on YouTube and elsewhere, which are the ones that, you know, push the stories into people's feeds. And so one of the things we thought about was, you know, this thing that other speakers have spoken about as well, about this kind of stopping and thinking before you like or share. This idea of, well, why has this thing appeared in my feed? Why has this appeared? And we know that stories that trigger negative emotions, for example, are more likely to be shared. We know that conspiracy theories and so on are more likely to be shared. So we wanted people to think about, well, why has that come to my feed? Why is that there? So we actually have a Horizon 2020. I'm just trying to find it here. Project called Provenance. And on provenance, I'll just give you a very quick kind of show of the tool. But the idea behind it is that we want to focus on the audiences. We want to focus on the people who are doing the liking or sharing. And you know, ultimately, over the longer term, what we want to do is try to change the dynamics of social sharing, so that verification is built into it. And it's much more about credible content. So the other thing we wanted to do was to make sure that we weren't the arbiters of the truth, that nobody could say, well, you know, who are you guys sitting in this university or that multilateral agency or whatever, you know, what do you know? We need to be able to make up our own minds. So the idea was that this tool, and this is just very much a kind of an exemplar demo, because we're just 18 months into this Horizon 2020 project. But this provenance tool that you can see here in the corner, this would run on your Facebook or on your Twitter or your Instagram or whatever your other one is. It's just a browser plugin. And you would see it at the top of any of your stories that come in. So the example here isn't migration. We have been doing migration stories as well, particularly in Spanish and so on. But just for the purposes of the demonstration, we've got a couple of different ones here. So this one is a story about Hillary Clinton and Assange and all of this kind of thing. So if you clicked into the provenance tool, you'd see the date. So you can see, okay, so that was published today. It's in green, there's no problem. It was published in the US. We expect it to be no problem. The source was this Alerta Digital, and a lot of fact checkers have found problems with that. So that's flagged as red. Then we look at the similarity. So has this been run on other websites? So especially when you get the stories early in their genesis, they're often put out by small kind of conspiracy websites. They won't have run anywhere else before they start to go viral. So we'll tell you about that. We analyze its tone, because as we know in particular that if anger is triggered, then that's a really good way of getting people's attention and sharing. And a lot of disinformation triggers anger. So if you click in here, you'll be told, well, look, this looks like they're actually trying to make you fearful or angry. So you kind of think, well, I wonder why they're trying to do that. It'll tell you about the standard of writing, you know, whether it's professional or not. So, and then interestingly, it'll also tell you about the image. So has this image or this video being used before? So, you know, some of the examples that some of our speakers were talking about before were images that had run before, and you know, it's often a good indication of things going wrong. Sorry, my screen is going up. And just to do it across different ones, so we can see here's one about Kim Jong-un, and it was the source that came up, the image, the writing style, and the fact that other similar things hadn't happened. And we have that for a large amount of stories. So again, this one, and then it just depends. This one will show you, for example, in the image, that the news could be real, but it's based on fake photos. The grandmothers in the two photos aren't the same, even though they looked alike. So this was about a woman resisting arrest. So we're hoping that this kind of a tool would just be enough to get people to stop and think, if you like, before they like and share. It'll heighten their critical thinking abilities, but we're also hoping it can be used in kind of media literacy training. It might even be useful, we're thinking, for some of our journalism training with our own journalism students, because again, it gets them to think about, you know, what are the different components of the stories and so on. Now, obviously, technology isn't the complete answer. There's all sorts of different answers. But, you know, I'm a former journalist, I'm a social scientist, and we're working with a lot of computer scientists in this. So I think it's that kind of combination of different disciplines and different kind of insights that hopefully will help us get to the bottom of some of this.
Great, thank you, Jane, for that really interesting presentation. I particularly like the simplicity of it and the kind of, it's not too complicated. It doesn't have word clouds and doesn't kind of make your head spin when you look at it. So, question maybe for a discussion later on is that, is this an automated process, or does it require sort of an analyst to go through it and kind of filter?
No, this is, so what we're working on at the moment, it's completely automated. So we've done, we find the disinformation, we work with the kind of things that Claire Wardell is putting up and so on. We work with the sites that we know are known disinformation. We're doing a lot of work in Spain, so we work on a lot of the ones that are behind Vox and the kind of racism and anti-migration ones, but also on COVID-related ones now, and we put those in, and then there's kind of machine learning that's going on behind it. So what we do is, I'll try to be as untechnical as possible. We work with a company called Newswhip, which is a small Dublin company that works with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian and the BBC and all sorts, where it looks at kind of social feeds, stories that are coming in from around the web, and feeds them up. So we take those, so we can find the stories that are beginning to move quickly, that are likely to go viral. And what we do is we run those stories through this. So by the time that they appear on your Facebook feed or on your Twitter feed, we already have this provenance logo on it. So the first time you see this story appearing, it might only have had 100 shares on it at the time, but if it looks like those shares have gone through anybody who we know to be a kind of a disinformation actor, or they're moving at different velocities, we'll already have run this automated material on it. So it comes way before the fact checkers could get in or so on. We're trying to get it right there at the very beginning of these stories to get people to stop and think before they start sharing them. Of course, it'll work on later stories as well, but the idea is to try to get it right there at the beginning when the bad actors are attempting to push out the problematic content.
Great, well, thank you very much. That's fascinating, and I'd love to learn more about it. And I think we could definitely learn a lot more about it. One small issue that we would probably think about is that, yes, it's relevant to us in the global north mostly on this call, on this in this webinar. But if it's in Myanmar and it's in the local language, maybe one of the many ethnic languages, and it might be having fatal consequences, I'm not sure it's going to be captured. So I think we need to have a little bit of on-the-ground reporting to complement it. But let me turn, if I may, to David Lebel, who I think is now connected, turbocharged from Berlin. David, please, welcome to Welcoming, the founding director of Welcoming International and Welcoming America, please.
Great. So I work for an organization called Welcome International. We're actually part of an organization I founded in 2009 called Welcoming America. And we work on the local level, and we've heard this theme sometimes throughout this great session about the benefits of working at the local level where there's high levels of trust and where a lot of the change in narratives actually happens on the ground. And we work, our work is with civil society organizations in local communities and local governments themselves, with the goal of creating more welcoming culture in communities and as well as more welcoming institutions. If we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. And we work with international partners or members who help us to do the work. So we have we started this work in the United States, and now work with members in Germany, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Spain, Canada, and Mexico. And so what we're doing is basically building an infrastructure from the local level up to the national level of places that are welcoming and that have an infrastructure to deliver positive messages, as well as to create policy change to make sure that the policies make inclusion and integration more likely. And so we have a network of these national partners. We help with narrative work, among other things, and we also develop standards, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So let's go to the next slide. So again, why do we focus on the local level? For one, cities are pragmatic. Cities have to be pragmatic. That's where people actually are. It's not theoretical at the local level. And these are lived realities: migration, climate change, other issues. And cities are already leading the way on tackling so many of these difficult challenges, including migration and inclusion. Cities are, trust in government is not at its highest right now, but cities are the most trusted level of government in poll after poll. And localized messages and messengers have more impact in the end. And you can see that in themes in advertising in the corporate sector as well. You see it more and more localized messages because you're really getting to people's in-group when you're talking about messages that are really adjusting to local realities. So let's go to the next slide. So Leonard talked about a story. I'm going to quickly tell the story of Nashville in the United States. This was starting way back in 2006. We were able to develop a methodology in Nashville, which was a place that had a very rapidly rising immigrant population, refugee population, and had seen a lot of backlash from the demographic changes and responses in the local community. And so in order to change that dynamic, if we go to the next slide. So this is just a slide about, and that's a mosque that was burnt down, unfortunately, outside of Nashville during this period. It was a period where Nashville was seen by The Nation magazine and others as an epicenter of the hate movements, anti-migrant movements in the United States back in the mid-2000s. So if we'll go to the next slide. So we utilized a methodology that's still used today around identifying leaders, trusted leaders from different sectors, which is really important. Everyone trusts leaders, but only leaders from their orientation, sometimes political, sometimes business, sometimes faith, etc. Facilitating contact, which of course in the time of COVID is harder, but it is not impossible. And can be done in a lot of different ways, starting virtually, but the contact between individuals, at least face-to-face, even on a screen, is an important way to change perceptions. And then communications itself, we used even some social media way back then, as well as analog billboards, radio ads, etc., to get some positive messages. Because information asymmetry is one of the biggest challenges to humankind, in my opinion, and on migration and immigrants, it's just part of humanity. If you don't have an infrastructure set up to address information asymmetry on immigration, then that messages almost always, especially in changing communities, are going to be inaccurate. So how do we get these positive messages? How do we get these accurate messages out there about immigrants in those very communities who share the values of the local community and who are contributing to the local community? So if we go to the next slide. And you can keep clicking, and there's one more, sorry. These are just two examples of leaders who we worked with. The mayor of Nashville at the time, Dean, one of the big business leaders. We worked with many business leaders to start to send more positive messages at a time when, again, the messages were not at all positive, they were quite negative. If we go to the next slide. And then, in the buckle of the Bible Belt, as they say, Nashville is, using religious messages was really, trying to talk about values in that local community was one of many important messages that we tested and we utilized. And then if we go forward, again, around trusted messengers. Owen, we'll go to the next slide, please. This was a report that we put out with the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, again, another trusted messenger, about the economic contributions that immigrants and refugees were bringing to Nashville in the business community and the general community. Another type of messaging that's important, not the only type that we recommend, but one of the types of messaging that's important, again, with that local twist. So now go to the next slide, please. And over time, we were able to change the climate, the perceptions. And we, in each of these cases, which I only have two more, there is data involved. We actually had data that demonstrated that we had shifted the climate that ended up being a referendum on an English-only bill, a bill to make English the only language of government in Nashville. Even though it looked bad at the beginning of our work, by the time in 2009, this referendum on English-only happened, the people of Nashville, by a large margin, voted against it. And then over time, Nashville started to gain a reputation as being one of the most welcoming cities for immigrants, certainly in the south of the US and possibly in the whole country, where it's seen that way today. So if we quickly go to the next slide, I'm trying to be very conscious of time here. Yeah, I'll just quickly go through this. As far as the use of data, that was an example of data on the back end. On the front end here, we did worked with local partners in Nebraska on a campaign and did a lot of focus groups to develop messages. On the left, it's Nebraska. Actually, on the right, it's Colorado. And each of these messages are very fine-tuned to the local reality and to local values. I'll just do an example on the left. American football is like religion in Nebraska, and so it was a value that was important and made its way to some of the billboards and social media advertising that we did. Let's move to the next slide. We also did face-to-face contact work and did pre-post polling in the dialogues that we held. And the data showed in these places that 70% of the people who had contact and had been exposed to the messaging, 70% of the time had a more positive perception of immigrants. That was a positive outcome. And then if we go to the next slide, in Michigan, in the Midwest of the United States, another messaging campaign was led. This is one of many messages, but certainly the economic contributions and the demographic contributions in a shrinking community, which is really what's happening in a lot of Michigan, was important. And you can see in the next slide some of the data. We did pre-post polling after this work was done and demonstrated that perceptions had improved. I don't have time to go through each of these numbers, but you can see that quantitatively perceptions were improved in these communities in rural Michigan. Through this work. So let's quickly go to the next slide. Yeah, really my last point is that, again, local is important, infrastructure, building the welcoming infrastructure is important, but you also, not just doing it to build local infrastructure, you can also scale to the national level by demonstrating the positive outcomes of doing all this work, of creating more welcoming communities. And so if we go to the next slide, we were able to demonstrate in all of these places, using also standards. We've developed standards so that a place like Dayton, Ohio, which is one of the first really engaged welcoming communities, they actually could get certified as welcoming because they had the right policies and the right infrastructure for narrative change. And they were audited by us and could be certified as welcoming. And then if we go to the next slide, once you can demonstrate the benefit and once you can demonstrate what success looks like as far as inclusion and positive messaging, then you can scale. And so in the United States, we've scaled to over 200 communities, from small towns to large cities. And if we go to the next slide, the same principle has held in our work around the world. We now work with again, New Zealand, Australia, UK, Germany, Spain, United States, Mexico, Canada, and all sorts of different partners. In New Zealand, it's the national government of New Zealand. That's also a partner in Canada. Whereas in Australia, it's a nonprofit called Welcoming Australia, Oxford University in the United Kingdom. But all of these entities are building these movements from the bottom up, from 1 community to 10 communities. Australia now has 50 communities that are advancing, that are welcoming. Some of them are being accredited as welcoming. But in all these places, you have that infrastructure in place. You have an infrastructure to deliver positive messages, to facilitate contact, but also to make sure inclusion and integration is working, because that's also really important for the narrative, and it's important to scale the work. Yeah, I think that, you know, with time, I'll just leave it at that. I won't go through the last couple of slides, but I look forward to the conversation, and thanks for your patience again with the technology. I apologize for that.
Many thanks, David. Great to see the overall project or scope or work, you know, growing so impressively. And I think, you know, the takeaway that I take from this is that it's all about hard work. It's all about building alliances at the community, city, and whatever level. And of course, you need funding all the way through. None of this happens in a vacuum. And I think also it's interesting to me that some of the countries, I'm not going to name them, that you have on the screen haven't been so friendly to the migrants in the public media, but yet I see, you know, there's a recognition, of course, that cities need to be functional, societies need to be functional, and managed migration, as we call it in IOM, you know, helps bring that about. But I think you're talking about keeping the communities viable and keeping it real in the communities. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to just quickly turn to Owen, but if you have another comment, I'd be delighted to hear you. Yeah.
No, thanks so much.
Okay, so Owen, our host, has a couple of questions from the audience. I know he's going to share them.
Thanks very much, Leonard. The first one we had in is an interesting one. It's perhaps towards Antonio. How has misinformation and hate speech joined hands to give rise to xenophobia in Europe specifically, and perhaps beyond its boundaries?
I couldn't hear very well. Could you please repeat?
No problem at all. In Europe, misinformation and hate speech joined hands to give rise to xenophobia in Europe and just beyond its borders.
Actually, I mean, from the point of view of what we observe, of course, the curve is growing from the point of view of observation, as you all know, and we have seen the different movements which have created a lot of social unrest outside and inside the EU as well. From the point of view of how we tackle and what we do, there is also a lot of work which has been done inside the Commission and inside the EAS, the External Action Service, about joining forces and working to upgrade the work on human rights respect and link together the disinformation, the fight to disinformation to the fight with online speech, hate speech, and speech against minorities. So this was already part of our work from the very beginning of the creation of the Code of Conduct and the Action Plan for Disinformation. And this is going to become actually one of the strongest points of work for the next weeks, months, and years, because you will see that there will be also an action plan against racism, which HRBP Borrell has already announced in his speech. And the action plan on democracy tries exactly to build on upgrading the resilience of our communities, of our democracy against xenophobia, racism, hate speech, and all that influences and creates a difficult environment. So this is exactly the way the EU is working upon, and this is what we are going to produce, not only for the respect of human rights, but also when we talk about online platforms and whatever is the online and offline attitudes of Europeans and also externally.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Another interesting one as well is, I pose this to the floor, what are the specific competencies that we can encourage in communities to build bridges in multicultural environments?
How we can, the question is how? I couldn't hear you very well, sorry.
So this is for the floor. This is for all anybody who's interested in answering it. So what are the specific competencies that we can encourage in communities, in multicultural communities, for them to address misinformation and disinformation?
If I can the floor before, and then I will leave to the other speakers. I would say that one of the main bulk of works can be, of course, media literacy, as it was already highlighted by other colleagues previously. The engagement, the strong and main engagement of civil society and youth. This is key. We have seen in the Eastern Partnership, in the South neighborhood and in the Western Balkans, that when we work with youth and when we work with young European ambassadors, as I mentioned before, and we involve young people and civil society together, the discourse, the narrative is very different, and we are able to deter polarization. Us versus them does not exist anymore. So this is on which we want to concentrate, that we want to work upon, and this is key, not only for people who work on human rights, but also for communicators and those who invest in online, offline work.
Any others from the panel like to take it on?
Yeah, I think I'll wait in it. I think empathy. I think empathy is something key that in a homogeneous community, between the members of that community, the disadvantaged and everybody else, seeing how it is from the other point of view, the other perspective, and especially in diverse communities, that is so important to bringing them together and understanding where everybody's coming from. It could be a cultural difference, it could be a religious difference, it could be political difference. But I think if we are able to empathize with others and see how things appear from their perspective, maybe we're better all able to get on and get over problems together.
Indeed, yeah, I think that's a very good point. Very good point indeed.
If I may add, I'd like to say that a good journalism tool or a good media tool would be to focus less. I know data is really important, but at the end of the day, stories of real people going through ordeals, journeys, success stories. So if the media focus can be on telling either positive or inspiring stories of people who have been in situations with illegal migration or with migration legally, we can relate more to stories and remember the stories of real people more than any data that you release. So to counter the false narratives, we have to be able to put a face, a name, a personality to a positive story. So in terms of reporting, I think using central characters, using positive stories will do a far better job than us giving any data or statistics about migration.
If I could add,
please.
I completely agree with the last two comments. That's both are spot on in my opinion. And just to add to that, I would say, yeah, along with real stories of real people, empathy, another side of empathy, sort of empathy in action in our work on the local level is first of all, connecting with people who can help around conflict resolution and dialogue, because there are methodologies there, and we've benefited from, and we have tools that use some of those methodologies. But you have to be able to listen to people, and you have to be able to sort of dial down and find the areas of common ground. And so a dialogue can also be a focus group if you do it well. A dialogue you can start to develop messages that are actually reaching the audience that you want to reach in the community. And then you can start using social media or other methodology or other tools to get messages out that are actually going to work. You need to be able to listen to people that you really want to reach and figure out ways to reach them. And there are ways to reach what we call the unsure, the 60% in the middle who are not way against, but are also not way for migrants in their communities. But yeah, the dialogue piece, the listening piece, the dialing it down, and then using those messages, what works in the dialogues in the focus groups to then reach out to a larger segment of that 60% is really important.
If I
May
may
I
just
add something?
Oh, sorry. I will come.
Migrant journalism, I think, is another dimension of all the points that have been made already. The problem very often is that migrants are spoken about and they're not given a space to speak themselves. And this, of course, has an institutional dimension. We know that media are notorious on being white and homogeneous in their professional force. And also in reporting, very often people who do not have the experience of migration speak on behalf of migrants. And this inevitably reduces this kind of invisibility, this inferiority of migrants is not being equal as us, not being able to speak in their own voices, thus not being members of our communities.
Very interesting points, thank you. Yeah.
Leonard, can I just say something quickly?
Yes, please do, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I think in some ways this actually speaks to the other side of that Safner Institute are interested in, which is around deliberation. And, you know, particularly sort of mini publics, but all sorts of deliberation. And when you look at the kind of values that are fostered within deliberative exercises, they are kind of specifically around empathy, around other regarding attitudes, around increasing levels of kind of trust and efficacy and so on. And I know there's increasing amounts of deliberation, and a lot at the moment is focused on climate action. You know, the French have just finished it, but there's deliberation around the world. And I think the conference on the future of Europe, which has been promised, could be, you know, a really promising venue to actually look at the Europe's history and stories and so on with peoples from outside of the geographic boundaries of the European Union, and that could be something that could prove very, very helpful and informative, and would allow the voices of the people involved to come through, which is I think the essential thing.
Thank you. I mean, one point that comes home to me is that we need good journalists, and we need trained and supported journalists, especially in the global south, as we like to call it, because too often the conversation revolves around the shared experience of the global north. And for example, on the migration side, there's far more migration internally in Africa than there is of any African people coming to Europe. Yet the entire hysteria is about Africans coming to Europe. So I think we need, you know, a rebalancing of the conversation where it matters and within those communities is long overdue. Long overdue. Oh, and do you have any more questions for us?
Here it's post-COVID, and given how prominent migrants have been at the front lines of the pandemic, the expectation is that there's going to be quite a severe recession or economic problems to follow. Is there a window available for us to really push positive, balanced narratives around migrants and their contributions? And I suppose looking at how the right may exploit later on in the year as the recession comes to pass, is there a real prominence that needs to be given to these type of messaging?
I would just intervene, if I may, and say, you know, right or left, it's not about right or left. The left can be as poisonous as the right. Let's put that piece aside. I mean, but there's no question, but this is now central to the political debate. There's no central question, but that the media are a bit adrift, and no fault of their own. The economy behind the media has collapsed. So I think there is need for us to learn from each other. I have learned so much on this call today, been particularly inspired by, I must say, by Mary Teresa. I think she's left now. Just how much there is to know about that. David, I've heard you speak many times, and I just want to know more and more. And there's so much hard work going on in so many arenas that I think it needs to be distilled and bottled and made available to journalists. And that will be my sneaky plug for the IOM Migration Media Academy, which is designed to be an inclusive, wide product, possibly not even with the IOM label on it, as an independent entity, because we recognize the centrality of the story to societies and the huge need of people who want to enter journalism, if only briefly, because they may not have a long career there, to be well informed and to be able to contribute sensibly. So I would just greatly encourage those of you listening to the webinar today and the panelists to help us do this, because we can't do it it's impossible to do it alone. We just think it's an idea whose time has come. But I think it's time for me. We've exhausted you. Probably some of you need to go and have a cup of tea and all that kind of thing. I'm going to ask, thank you all enormously, all the panelists for their great contributions. I'm not going to go through the names, they're all there. Really enjoyed it tremendously. Thanks to those who asked questions. Thanks to Owen for keeping the show on the road. And let me turn now to Leleni, whose great idea this was in the first place and who's doing the heroic job with IOM in Dublin. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Had we been together in a conference room, I think we would have had a well-deserved cup of tea and cakes. Unfortunately, we're on these virtual meetings with COVID. But regardless, I'd like to genuinely and sincerely thank you as facilitator, but also the panelists, really insightful panelists that we had today, and that really shared interesting tools, motivations, knowledge with us from all over the world, which I really, when we were discussing about that webinar, really focused on, because we need to hear the voices of everyone, from the experts to the voice of migrants from everywhere. And I'll probably just one note with my note of thanks, maybe just one takeaway is the fact that a lot of you mentioned the importance of growing that space. Growing the space, of course, for the voice of migrants, but I think growing the space from our perspective is growing the space and working with the academic space, with the practitioner space, with everyone, literally among part of that call today, working in the field of media, testing it, trying to develop digital tools, trying to think more about it, which we all, I mean, we don't always have the chance to do that when we're working in an organization like IOM or the UN, or working on policy, or everyone is siloed somehow in the work that they do, but coming together in a collaborative approach, I think, is the way to go. I really liked Maria Rondero's comment on the fact that, after all, migration is a natural process and it's always been there, but it's true that with growing demographics, growing disparities, growing technologies and digital tools, there definitely is a need to, I think, bring in the realities more, and this whole story approach that she emphasized on even more today, to give the right stories and where it started and when it ends, if it ever ends. And the whole debate, I mean, that's a huge debate, so I'll stop there, but the politicization of information, which gains a lot of interest naturally, but which is not necessarily fair to what that reality of a migrant story is all about. So I'm also very much looking forward to continuing that exchange with you. It was a first webinar. We really hope that this academy will start shortly in the year, and we can really focus on the aspects of training and fact checking and all these tools that you're all developing. And again, a very big thank you to all of you, and a very big thank you to Owen, who's been an incredible incredible technical host, and a great help on that webinar. So thanks to you, Owen, and thanks to Leonard, and to everyone again. All the best.
Thanks, Lily, very much, and thanks to all the participants. Yeah.